Welcome, everyone. My name is Phil Triandafilopoulos. I'm an associate professor of political science at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, and the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Thank you very much for attending the 2021 Hellenic Heritage Foundation annual lecture. Who Owns History? Elgin's Loot and the Case for Returning Plundered Treasure, a discussion with Geoffrey Robertson QC. On behalf of everyone involved in the Hellenic Studies program at the University of Toronto, I thank the Hellenic Heritage Foundation for its support of this lecture series and all of our efforts. I also thank the outgoing director of the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, Professor Randall Hansen, and our dedicated colleagues, Professors Themis Arovestas and Robert Austin. We're all grateful also to Larissa Yarovenko for her help in organizing today's event and her help right across the event's calendar. And I'm especially delighted to introduce our special guest. Geoffrey Robertson QC is founder and head of Doughty Street Chambers, the United Kingdom's leading human rights legal practice. He has a distinguished career as a trial counsel and human rights advocate. He has been a United Nations war crimes judge, a counsel in many notable Old Bailey trials, has defended hundreds of men facing death sentences in the Caribbean, and has won landmark rulings on civil liberty from the highest courts in Britain, Europe, and the Commonwealth. His book, Crimes Against Humanity, has been an inspiration for the global justice movement. And his other books include Bad People and How to Be Rid of Them, A Plan B for Human Rights Freedom, and the acclaimed memoir, The Justice Game. Mr. Robertson received the New York State Bar Association's Award for Distinction in International Law and Affairs in 2011, and was the Australian Humanitarian of the Year in 2014. In 2018, he was awarded an Order of Australia for his, quote, distinguished service to the law and the legal profession as an international human rights lawyer and advocate for global civil liberties, unquote. Today's lecture draws its title from his excellent 2019 book, which argues in favor of the return of the Parthenon marbles to Greece, as well as the return of other antiquities, a depressingly long list of such antiquities, to other countries. I encourage everyone to read it. Mr. Robertson will lecture for about 25 minutes to half an hour, and then take questions. Please post your questions through Zoom's Q&A function. And please join me in welcoming Geoffrey Robertson to the University of Toronto. Please, Geoffrey.
Hello, I don't know when you can hear this fire alarm going off in the background. I hope it will not last long. I'm not on fire, I've just checked, so I will continue. Can you hear me effectively?
Yeah, there you go.
It's a pleasure to talk today about the Parthenon and its marbles, the 600-foot frieze and the sculptures that belong on its walls. It's a wonder of the ancient world, the only wonder that survives today, albeit cut in half, bifurcated, and despoiled by Lord Elgin. Half of it remains in Athens in a new museum built specially for it. The other half is in a gloomy gallery in North London in the British Museum. Now, what is so remarkable about the Parthenon in UNESCO says that it is a universal symbol of the classical spirit and civilization from the greatest architectural and artistic complex bequeathed by Greek antiquity to the world. And the British Museum itself admits the marbles rank above the highest achievement of mankind, not only for their aesthetic qualities, but for their central place in the cultural history of ancient nations. So, what are they doing in Half? What are they doing in North London, away from where they were built in about 440 BC? The Acropolis was the theatre on the hill. It still survives. You can see it from wherever you are in Athens. When the Parthenon was being built, Aeschylus and Sophocles, Euripides and Aristophanes were having their plays performed in the theatres around it. Pythagoras was pondering theorems. Herodotus was writing something called History, and there, working on the Parthenon as a stonemason, was someone we know as Socrates. So it was a pretty amazing time and place. And it was the brainchild of what really the father of democracy, Pericles, built to pay tribute to Athena, the city god, and to recall the triumphs that the Greeks had achieved over in Marathon and Salamis against the marauding Persians. But above all, it was built by Pericles to celebrate something he called democracy. He said in one of his funeral orations, democracy is administration in the hands of the many, not the few, with equal justice to all. So it celebrated the city that had the first democracy in the world, which had thought it out. It had acquired wealth from protecting other islands, and it had attained a degree of civility, I think, that you can see in the frieze in the procession. Peace and democracy, playing games. You can look as if at an ancient newsreel at this extraordinary festival in Athens that was depicted in the sculptures. Here they are, 2,500 years ago, playing games, talking, walking, drinking, a lot of drinking, and as they happily proceeded up the hill to pay tribute to the goddess. And if you look at any recreation of the Parthenon, you see that it was designed as a unity with the sculptures and the frieze, an integral part of the vision of its great architects, Pericles and Phidias. So where is it now? There's a wonderful and I think totally accurate description by Professor Joan Connolly of it. The sculptures derive their original and essential meaning from immediate context of one another, the sanctuary they share, the city for which they were created. Apart from one another, as they are between Athens and London, they are merely relics, however finely wrought. The wholeness of the Parthenon demands our respect and warrants our every effort to reunify it such as we can. Let us for a moment consider the state of the central figures on the west pediment. Poseidon's shoulders are held in London, while his pectoral and abdominal muscles remain in Athens. Athena's battered head, neck, and right arm are displayed in the new Acropolis Museum in Athens, while her right breast remains in the British Museum. This deliberate and sustained dismemberment of what are some of the most sublime images ever carved by humankind brings shame on those who work to uphold this state of affairs. Well, those who work to uphold it are the British Museum and the British government. How did it come to this? Well, the Parthenon, built in 440 BC, took about 15 years. Ravages of the Goths didn't destroy it. The ravages of Christianity didn't destroy it. It stayed in place. It was occupied by the Turks, by the Ottoman Empire, as it was then, in 1458, and they showed it great respect. They didn't allow anyone to touch it. The French wanted it, and they offered a lot of money in 1780, but the Ottoman Empire refused. The only damage that was done to it happened in 1687, when the Venetians attacked Athens, and a lot of gunpowder went off and destroyed a section of it. You can see the ruins. Columns came down, not all of them, most of them were stayed, and there was a lot of rubble. That's important for the story. The marble rubble of smashed statues and columns littered the ground and was left on the ground. Now, we spool forward to 1800. Lord Elgin, who was a Scottish lord, that didn't amount to much. He wasn't an English lord, although he wanted a peerage from England. And that was one of his main objectives, actually, when he was made ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. He went out with the objective of getting these miracles of Greek statues, molds of them. He wanted to, because it was the only thing allowed, to take molds and build replicas of them in his house in Scotland. So he amassed a workforce and sent his cleric, the Reverend Hunt, with it to mold and draw, and that was the extent of his request. But they had some difficulties even doing that. And so he got a fairly high-ranking person at what was called the Sublime Porte. It was the Sultan's place in Istanbul, to give him a letter that told the two governors, there was a military governor and a civil governor, and they would supervise access to the Parthenon, and it told them to give Elgin's workmen the right to enter and to draw and to mold these amazing sculptures and to pick up bits of marble on the ground. Now, that was the only permission that Elgin was ever given. So he knew that he would not have permission to take the statues away, let alone to rip them off the walls. They were all part of this amazing building. And he never offered to pay for them because obviously he knew that they weren't for sale, and the Ottomans, obeying the law at the time, which required occupying countries to respect local temples in the countries they occupied, they would never give him permission. So how did he get them? He bribed heavily. All sorts of bribes went to the two Turkish governors of the Parthenon. We've got lists of them. They're silver pistols, horses, the best English clothes, telescopes. He brought them gold, silver encrusted telescopes, extraordinary gifts that as a wealthy man, his wealth through his wife actually, but he had enough money to extend these copious bribes. So that was how his workmen were allowed. The governors turned a blind eye with all the money in their pockets and in their homes. They turned a blind eye while his workmen ripped off the sculptures from the walls, damaged them, cut them in half to get them down, and stored them secretly in the home of the British consul in Athens. So, and then they waited until a British warship would put in at Piraeus, and they'd take them down to the port, and they would load them on board and take them back to London. And that went on for quite a number of years. Now, that is the simple truth, and it's a truth that has been verified time and again. The British Museum has always claimed that he had something called a firman, which was a license from the Sultan. Elgin later claimed he had one, but he didn't. Historians have ransacked the archives in Istanbul, and it's quite clear that he had no sort of license at all that he would need before he could rip these sculptures off the wall and take them away. So in simple terms, he stole them. He had no right to take them, and he did, back to London. Now, that went on for several years while he was ripping them off the temple and paying the governors for the pleasure of doing so. When in time he got rather poor, the sculptures were in London, he was almost bankrupt. He wanted to sell them. He offered them to the British government for 75,000, which was quite a lot of millions in those days. And the government held an inquiry in Parliament. And the first thing he was asked was, where's your title? What right do you have to these sculptures that were stored in London? And he couldn't answer. He couldn't produce any title to them. So that's why when the British Parliament decided to acquire them, it was a fait accompli. They were wonderful objects. They were there for the taking, but they refused to pay the money he wanted. They paid only half of it because his title was non-existent. And what they did was pass an act. This is what governments do. They passed a law that deemed the sculptures the property of the British Museum. So the only right that exists in Britain to keep them is this statutory act that deems them the property of the British Museum. Elgin had no property in them at all. But he needed a cover story. And this is the cover story that the British Museum still promotes. He said, oh, when I went to Athens, I saw these terrible Turks stealing pieces of marble, and I saved these wonderful statues from the Turks. Well, there's a simple answer to that, which is that he was lying through his teeth, because he never went to Athens until a year later. A year of plundering the temple went on before he even came to Athens to see anything. So he simply lied through his teeth. The committee and Parliament were very critical of Elgin. They never gave him his his English peerage, which he wanted, and they, in fact, regarded him as an ambassador who had let the side down because he was seeking to profit from the job from his ambassadorial office. He was condemned and criticized roundly in Parliament, but nonetheless, the objects of his theft were purchased and deemed to be the property of the British Museum. So Elgin stole the statues, and the British Museum was the receiver of this stolen property. They stayed there. A number of poets went and saw them. Keats wrote several poems about them. Beauty is truth, truth, beauty, that is all you need to know on earth, and so forth. So they were stored there, but they needed a large room. And in 1920, one of the great fraudsmen of the time, he was called Duveen, he was made money out of taking art confiscated from Jewish people in Germany and giving it a high reputation and selling it to Americans. And so he was very rich, and he donated a gallery, the Duveen Gallery, named after himself, for storage of these, the remarkable parts of the frieze, about half of it, the British Museum had, courtesy of Elgin's theft. And he took a look at them. They were brownish. They'd originally been painted in many colors, but he decided he wanted them white. I don't know why, but he arranged for them to be painted, scoured and painted and in white, so that they are really, as in their present state, nothing like the statues that were on the Parthenon. But that in the course of this exercise of whitening the statues, they were partly destroyed. So it can't be said this exercise went on. His workmen did it in the late 1930s, and this was led the statues to deteriorate. And so it was certainly not the case that the British, as the British Museum claims, that it has been a careful custodian of them. What happened then is really the Greeks had been asking for them back, made the first request via their king in 1836. Nothing happened. They repeatedly requested, and the British government refused. But in the war, something happened. Greece was the only country in Europe to support Britain in the battle against the Nazis. And Britain, the Foreign Office, thought that it was time to take a close look at their claim. And the Foreign Office decided that it should be upheld, that the Greeks owned, deserved, needed these amazing statues. And that was taken up by Melina Mercouri, who became the Greek foreign minister. They are the very essence of Greekness, she said in 82, 83. And she gave a lot of world attention to the problem of having this amazing wonder of the ancient world, the only one left, divided in half. And unfortunately, she clashed with another remarkable woman, one Mrs. Thatcher, who didn't like her at all and decided that the statues should, Elgin's loot, as it were, should always remain in the British Museum.
And that has been Britain's attitude right to the present day. UNESCO keeps telling it to mediate. No way will it do that. It's interesting. I live opposite the British Museum, and I watch with amusement every few months when they change the description at the front of the Duveen Gallery to change the lies that they tell about it. I went there a few days ago, and this is what they say. Lord Elgin acquired the sculptures in 1801. I love the word acquired. It's better than stole. I go on. The Ottoman Sultan granted permission for Elgin to remove the sculptures from the Parthenon. That's a flat lie. I mean, you expect better of British cultural institutions, but that is just one big lie. The Sultan never granted permission or even thought about it. All Elgin had was a letter from one of his officials asking the local governor to allow his workmen in to mold and to draw and pick up pieces of stone on the ground. Well, it goes on. The Parthenon's scaffolding was being damaged at an alarming rate. Elgin appealed to officials and was granted written permission, brackets, affirm, to remove, quote, any pieces of stone with inscriptions. That too is a lie. The pieces of stones with inscriptions that he had the right to take were on the ground with the rubble. And he was never there in 1801 to see any alarming damage, and he never obtained a written permission to rip those sculptures off the wall to which they were affixed. So the demand of Greece is for reunification of this amazing edifice. It can't, for many years, of course, it had the British Museum, the British government had a good argument. They said, well, we don't want to return the sculptures to a place on the walls of the Parthenon where they will be affected by car fumes coming up from the motorways of Athens. Well, that was a good argument until the new Hellenic Museum, new Acropolis Museum opened. Remarkable architecture in itself, but they're specially for the return to, or the reunification of the marbles. If you go, it's a wonderful place. It's just below the Parthenon. So if you look up from the marbles that it has, you can see the walls of the Parthenon with the blue Attic sky above. And that's where they should be. That's where the world should see them. That's where they will best be appreciated in a museum that concentrates on the remarkable Greek art and civilization of the period. So the argument about traffic fumes doesn't operate any longer. And it's difficult to see what argument does. The museum, of course, says that it has millions of visitors a year. Well, I think Athens would have the same number if it got the marbles back. The museum says, oh, but we're a museum of the world. We're a universal, cosmopolitan museum, so people can come and see and compare the art with the art of other periods? Well, of course, the whole point is that the marbles are unique and are best sited in a museum which has the other wonderful Greek art of that period. So the question of where they should go and how to get them there is an interesting question. The Greeks have relied for over a century nearly 2 centuries, on diplomacy, and diplomacy has got them nowhere. Question then is whether law, international law, might work, whether they could argue, I think they can, that restitution, certainly reunification here, is necessary where cultural heritage has been stolen or wrongfully taken. That is certainly the case with the marbles, and it would take a trip to the International Court of Justice in The Hague to make out that case. It's a lengthy argument. Many countries have accepted that the keys to their history belong to the people and should be retrieved from countries to which they've been transported by smugglers or stolen. And there is quite a lot of authority that points to that. There is, in parallel, a movement to restitution of cultural property that was stolen in the colonial period. President Macron started this a couple of years ago when he said that the cultural heritage of Africa can no longer belong in or be locked in European museums, as it is. And there have been various countries now that want their cultural property back. There is certainly India, there is certainly Nigeria, many African countries were looting. The classic example of the bronzes from Benin. Benin was a remarkable city in Nigeria, which had a king and amazing art designed in the 16th century, the Benin bronzes. And in 1897, the British Army, in a so-called punishment raid, it was what we would now call war crimes and crimes against humanity, attacked Benin and took every valuable item they could find and put it up, as the British Army did in those days, in what they called a booty auction, which allowed the British Museum to buy several thousand of these amazing Benin bronzes. They sold some of them in European museums, and they are being returned as we speak to the Royal Museum in Benin, but not from Britain, not from the British Museum. Well, that's the problem, and that is how it is increasingly being resolved. We're hearing more and more of restitution claims from countries whose cultural property was savagely stolen. In Benin, they killed the women and children as well as the men. These were barbaric times. The Chinese, one of the few international laws and conventions they want is for return of cultural property because they suffered so badly when their amazing palace, summer palace, was burnt. It was burnt by Lord Elgin, his son, the son of the Lord Elgin, the 7th Lord, led the British Army in China in the 1950s and stole 2 million cultural items from this amazing summer palace, and then he burnt it, including within it some 150 eunuchs and palace servants. Terrible events of the colonial period, all involving theft of valuable items. I don't know how many Canadian Aboriginal objects there are in the British Museum. It's got 9 million of Indigenous items, so I imagine there are some. I'm surprised that we haven't heard from Canada as we have from other countries, including Australia. Australia has some amazing Aboriginal artifacts that have been stolen. People, I won't go into the details because I don't have time, but anyway, there are appalling acts in so many Commonwealth countries against the Indigenous people in colonial times, involving the theft of items that are in stock in the British Museum. Most not exhibited, actually. It only exhibits a very small fraction of what it gets. So back to the marbles. How do we get them? The Prime Minister of Greece went to see Boris Johnson a few months ago and to ask to offer a lot of other treasures in, if only he would return the marbles. And of course, he said, oh, it's not the British government. You've got to ask the trustees of the British Museum. And this was a lie. Boris Johnson is given to lying, and this was a total lie because the British have an act of de-accession, forbidding de-accession. So the museum trustees are not allowed to give away any item from the museum. They have to Parliament has to pass a law. When they had some stolen Jewish, just a moment, when they had some, discovered some pictures that had been stolen by the Nazis, they couldn't give them back. They went to court to ask the court to allow them to give it back. The court said, no, you have to have a law passed by Parliament, which it did. And the Australians wanted their constitution back. I don't know why, but the original constitution was locked up in a national gallery, and they had to pass a special law to that. So they passed laws, the British Parliament, to extract and de-access the items for Australians and for Jewish people, but not for Greeks. So it will require a government. Except there's only one way, I think, that they will get them back, and that is if they encourage the General Assembly of the United Nations to ask for an opinion, an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, because I think law will advance to the stage of requiring the return of wrongfully taken cultural property. But that would require a 2/3 majority at the UN, but I think Greece would get that. 104 nations voted for one of its motions a couple of years ago, and I think that time is ripe. And I think the only great thing left about Great Britain, is that it generally complies with international court decisions. Other countries don't, but Britain has, since Gladstone, always complied with the decisions of international courts. So I think that's the only surefire way of forcing Britain to return the marbles. Otherwise, it's a bone of contention that will be picked by diplomats pointlessly for many years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. That was really wonderful. so much covered in so succinctly. And we do have some time for questions, and I'll pose two to you. First, where does British public opinion stand on the return of the marbles? Is the British public as set in its ways as the trustees of the British Museum, or political leadership? That's one question. And the second has to do with the argument, the counter argument that's been made by some, that it's better to keep them in London because the British Museum is a universal museum. It's a encyclopedic museum. You do talk about this at some length in your book, and I wonder if you could encapsulate your position on that argument, your counter argument to that.
Yes. The first question was, just remind me.
The British public. What is
Yes.
public opinion like?
Of course, one tends to forget the public, but when asked, they say they're in favor. There are always majorities in favor of return. And the only leader who has picked up on that was Jeremy Corbyn, who said that he would return the marbles to the Parthenon. But otherwise, there has been silence. The British Museum trustees are all billionaires. They all come from there are a handful of token artists, but they are not archaeologists or historians. They are come from BlackRock or from commercial companies. They're very wealthy. George Osborne is the trustee, a former chancellor, conservative chancellor, who is making money from private enterprise for the last few years. And so they've got no particular moral status or ability to decide these questions. And they tend to go along with the government. So it's a buck passing situation. But the British public, when asked, has tended to favor return of the marbles. Now, the old chestnut, I think, of the Universal Museum, what did they call it? The Encyclopedic Museum. Well, you can go to the British Museum and you can look at the Rosetta Stone, and then you walk from ancient Egypt, and then you can walk to see at the Duveen Gallery the Greek art of that period. And then you can go you can go and see the chessmen from the Isle of Lewis. You can see lots of Egyptian mummies, and you can see all sorts of things. It's a kind of museum of curiosity. Of course, you could see the marbles in a different light. They could have all sorts of ways of bringing home the remarkable features of exact replicas. There is now a method whereby they can be reproduced exactly through computer technology with the stone, the pentelic stone that was used. But will the museum allow it? No, the museum will not. It will keep by hook or by crook. It keeps by lies at the moment. It will keep the marbles, and it would not allow this non-invasive technology to measure and to photograph the marbles, because that would produce a situation where people would say, look, you can get the exact replica, why not be content with that and send the originals back to Greece? So my answer is that it's far better for this wonder of the world to be together in Athens, where it was designed and conceived, and not split in half or as a tidbit in a smorgasbord of encyclopedic bits and pieces.
We have two more, I would say, legal questions. The first has to do with, beyond reunification, is there an argument to be made for reparations, perhaps in the same way that people can claim restitution based on what's the legal term, pain and anguish, right? This has been going on for a very long time. So that's question one. In addition to reunification, perhaps reparations. And question two is very specific. Would repealing or amending the 1963 British Museum Act pave the way for the return of the marbles?
I can answer the second question clearly, yes. That would give the British Museum the power that American museums have. I don't know whether Canadian museums have it, to let the original people have back the cultural heritage that had been stolen, so that their youth could begin to appreciate the history of their country. And that's very important, particularly in African countries. So it's not so much the repeal of the act. You would only need to amend one small section of it to get rid of this deaccession problem, French call it inalienability problem, that national museums are forced to keep everything that they acquire or that are donated to them, and can't get rid, unless they're indecent, of any of their possessions. They can't give they couldn't give back the pictures stolen from the Jews by the Nazis without a special amendment through Parliament. So that is what needs to happen, not necessarily the whole act, but certainly the section that prohibits any return. There's an extraordinary acquisition from some colonial venture of Ethiopian sacred totems that cannot be viewed. That's except by a particular priest or a section of priests. And so the British Museum solemnly keeps these items in a locked a locked cupboard, and only allows the particular priest from Ethiopia access to them. It doesn't display them, but even so, it won't give them back. Even though it can never display them, it won't give them back to the priests in Ethiopia because it can't. And it says that makes no effort at all to have the 1963 Act amended. So that's where American museums sometimes sell one lot of their art and acquire another. They use it, their deaccession powers, to build up the museum. It's really very senseless. The other question, reparations, well, I know that Greek people have suffered, and I went with the Mal Clooney and Professor Palmer when we were engaged by the Greek government to look at the question back about 5 years ago, when we were mobbed, or at least Amal was, by people who were crying and obviously emotionally involved in getting them back. So the Greek people have suffered. The British rightly were going to, in return for their support against the Nazis, were going to return it, and they didn't. But reparations are difficult. There's still, Jamaicans are still trying to get reparations. It's not a subject that has been, compensation, of course, for injuries, for war damage, for aggression. We've got some precedents for that. But reparations for loss of cultural property, not yet. It may be, and this has been suggested in the case of Jamaica, which wants reparations for slavery, that a better course would be a museum or something donated by Britain to the entire people. So that's one possibility. But at the moment, the law, while it grants compensation in civil cases locally, hasn't got its head around the idea of reparations for loss of cultural property.
Thank you. So a comment and then a question. The comment I will read verbatim because I think it really nicely captures what I feel, and I'm sure many members of the audience feel. Quote, brilliant and insightful talk. Thank you wholeheartedly for your advocacy in support of reunification and restitution of Elgin's plunder to its rightful home atop the Acropolis, unquote. So we can move from that pithy but very accurate comment to a question. So moving away from the British Museum and Lord Elgin and the British, descendants since, to Germans. And of course, I did spend a couple of years in Germany myself, and the museums are outstanding, but they're partly outstanding because they've stolen so much stuff, and they've built these amazing viewing halls where you can see the plunder in its full. It's quite remarkable.
Queen Nefertiti in particular.
Well, that, and also the temple from Turkey, and there's this the long list that our questioner has appended some examples. But it gets back, I think, to this question of a certain range of museums. So maybe, I know that in the book you do talk a little bit about the German case in detail, so maybe you could summarize your position on them. Maybe that's appropriate given the question.
Okay, I'll just make one correction to the comment, for which I'm very grateful, but they won't go back atop the Parthenon, because that would be to tempt the traffic fumes again. They will go to the top floor of the new Acropolis Museum, which is an amazing place. You look through the ceiling, which is glass, and you see the Parthenon and above you and the blue attic sky, and you think that's where these amazing sculptures belong. As to Egypt, yes, all colonial nations did dreadful things in the 19th century. They killed and they despoiled and they mass murdered. But King Leopold of Belgium being the worst, probably, but the Germans certainly, wherever they were, in Tanganyika, in other Egypt, they stole. The Nefertiti is perhaps the classic example because she was discovered in one of those joint Egyptian-German archaeological parties, which allowed the Germans to take half, and usually the not the best half, but she was smuggled out, put under rags, and they pretended that she wasn't part of the what they called the partage. And so that's how they got her to Berlin in I think it was 1912. And then after the war in 1923, the Berlin Museum announced that they had her, and the Egyptians went crazy. They demanded her back, but they had no power, much. But then they got some diplomatic gumption and they applied to Hitler. They said, we must have a, no way, said Hitler. There's this wonderful telegram from him saying that she is to be the centerpiece of my museum in Linz. Linz was where he was born. And so he was going to build the Führer Museum with the great art of the places he conquered. And he promised them that Nefertiti would have a room of her own at the center of this Nazi museum complex. But of course, the Germans didn't give her up, and the Egyptians are still asking for her. They've got a new museum, Pyramid Museum. They've got a new museum in Cairo. They want her to have her own museum because she is, as it were, the incarnation of beauty. And she was an amazing queen, if you read about her. She started a new monotheistic religion and had some extraordinary qualities, including the ability to keep the king faithful to her throughout. And we're talking about this 2000 or 3000 BC. But you could and should perhaps have a whole temple to her, but she's in the new museum in Berlin, which is going through a lot of troubles. It's had advisors resign. It's got to do something about its capture of colonial acquisitions. So it's a problem. The restitution issue is a problem throughout not just the art world. It involves law, it involves diplomacy, it involves it involves our relationships with former colonies. And so I think that is the question of reparations can perhaps be worked into that by way of securing museums in other countries in Africa or the Caribbean, which can keep these great items securely. Because I have to say, I drafted a convention for the return of cultural objects stolen in the past. And one of the conditions that would permit a museum to resist return would be the insecurity of the place to which they were destined to go. A lot of museums have no real support, are very unsafe. There were some items returned from Belgium to the Congo some years ago, and they very quickly appeared on lists in Europe of with items available to purchase. So there has to be a place to which they can safely and securely be returned, is one important condition, because I doubt that you could return items to Libya, for example, where there are wars going on. I doubt that you could return items where there is to museums where there is no protection against theft, or where there is no air conditioning, for a start.
Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid we're at the end of our lecture. On behalf of our sponsor, the University of Toronto, and especially our audience, I want to thank you very, very much for an excellent lecture and very generous questions, thoughtful answers to excellent questions from the audience. We wish you well.
Yes.
And maybe you're very busy, we know, but maybe you could return to this this project as well, because it's, as you know better than I do, very meaningful to many people of Greek descent. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. Have a great day, everybody.